Ladies and gentlemen, there are stories that the world tells us, and then there are stories that live beneath the surface, hidden in the quiet spaces, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. What you think you know about an engagement ring is probably very simple, a symbol of love, a tradition, perhaps a shiny object that carries sentimental weight. But what if I told you that the real story behind one engagement ring is not about diamonds, not about luxury, not even about tradition? What if the story is about something far more profound, about consciousness, memory, biology, and the way we humans assign meaning to objects that otherwise would be nothing more than atoms arranged in a lattice? This is not merely the story of a piece of jewelry. It is the story of how the human brain encodes love, sacrifice, and destiny into a single object, so deeply that when you hold it, you are not just holding matter, you are holding memory, history, and intention. And when we strip away the romantic language, when we study this from the lens of neuroscience and human psychology, we discover something fascinating. The ring is not an accessory, it is an anchor that ties together biology, emotion, and the possibility of an entire future. Think about it. For centuries, cultures across the world have placed enormous importance on symbols, rings, amulets, necklaces, artifacts. A circle carved in stone, a band of metal, a woven cord. These things by themselves are ordinary, and yet they become extraordinary when we pour meaning into them. What makes this possible? It is the uniquely human capacity to connect objects to stories, and stories to emotions, and emotions to identity. The engagement ring I am speaking of is not about wealth or extravagance. In fact, its real story challenges the very assumption that love must be proven by material value. Instead, it was designed to encode meaning in a way that resonates with the brain's deepest architecture of attachment. You see, the human brain is a predictive machine. It is constantly mapping associations, linking faces to feelings, places to emotions, and objects to memories. This is why a single song can make you cry, why a childhood scent can transport you decades back in time, and why an engagement ring, if designed with intention, can carry an entire philosophy of love. This particular ring was not chosen from a shelf, not crafted as a display of wealth, but engineered almost like a neural interface, a bridge between human emotion and physical reality. Let me explain. When we fall in love, the brain releases a cocktail of chemicals: dopamine, oxytocin, vasopressin. These create feelings of euphoria, bonding, and trust. But here is the interesting part: the brain doesn't just feel. It needs anchors to store and stabilize these emotions. That's why we create rituals. Weddings, vows, anniversaries, tokens. They are not arbitrary traditions. They are psychological stabilizers, helping fragile emotions solidify into enduring commitments. The engagement ring is one of the most powerful stabilizers of all. But in this case, the ring was constructed not as a tradition, but as a story in itself. A story that embeds sacrifice, resilience, and vision into its very design. I want you to imagine something, a ring not made to flaunt status, but designed as a blueprint of a relationship, each element carrying a deliberate message. The metal, for instance, was not mined from some distant luxury source, but chosen to represent sustainability and responsibility. That choice tells us something: that love, in its highest form, is not about what you take from the world, but about what you give back to it. The stone, instead of being chosen for size or rarity, was selected for the story it carried. A story of resilience under immense pressure, a crystal that had endured forces so extreme that its very structure testified to survival. That is a metaphor for love itself, not fragile, not fleeting, but shaped under pressure, made strong by endurance. When people first heard of this ring, they assumed it was a billionaire's gesture, a display of excess, but the truth is the opposite. The story behind it reveals not extravagance, but intentionality, and intentionality, in neuroscience, is everything. We know from decades of brain research that what gives objects meaning is not the object itself, but the narrative we attach to it. When a person gives you something, and it carries with it a sacrifice, a struggle, or a piece of their own story, your brain encodes that object differently. It no longer sits in the same mental category as a random piece of metal or stone. It becomes infused with emotional salience. It becomes part of you. This ring carried exactly that, not just because of what it was, but because of what it represented. To understand its story, you must understand the human need for permanence in a world that is inherently impermanent. All of us know that relationships are fragile, that life is unpredictable, that tomorrow is never guaranteed. Yet we crave symbols that defy that uncertainty. A ring, a perfect circle with no beginning and no end, is our attempt to carve permanence into existence. But here's the deeper question: does permanence really exist, or is it something we must actively construct in our minds? This is where the story turns from jewelry to philosophy. The real story behind the engagement ring is that it was built not only as a token of love, but as a reminder of impermanence, that true permanence does not come from objects, but from choices repeated daily in the face of adversity. In its design, subtle imperfections were left visible, a tiny asymmetry, a flaw not polished out. Why? Because real love is not flawless. It is the opposite. It is the willingness to embrace imperfection, to see beauty in what is incomplete. When I look at this story, I see not just romance, but science, because human attachment thrives not in perfection, but in vulnerability. Neuroscientific studies show that we bond more deeply when we share flaws, when we allow ourselves to be seen fully, rather than presenting an idealized image. This ring was a symbol of that truth. It rejected the sterile perfection of machine, polished gems, and instead embodied the rawness of authentic connection. But let's go deeper still. There is something remarkable about how we humans externalize our inner worlds. When you hold an object like this ring, you are not just holding metal and stone. You are holding neural patterns, encoded memories, emotional projections. You are holding the invisible architecture of another human being's mind, crystallized into a physical form. And here is where the story of this ring transcends even personal love, because it was created not only as a private symbol, but as a message to the world that love, at its highest level, is not consumption but creation. That message resonates today more than ever. We live in a world where status often overshadows meaning, where people measure love in carats and price tags. But the real story behind this ring dismantles that illusion. It tells us that the value of a symbol is not in its cost, but in the intention and sacrifice behind it. Now let me pause for a moment and share a memory that illuminates this truth. Years ago, I spoke with a scientist who had lost his wife. She had worn a simple silver ring, inexpensive by any standard. After she passed away, that ring became the most valuable object in his life. Not because of what it was, but because of what it carried. He told me, "When I touch it, I feel her presence. It is as if my brain has stored her essence inside the metal." That is how human memory works. Objects become vessels. They are not inert. They are alive with the stories we pour into them. The same principle applies here. The ring we are speaking of is alive with meaning, not just as a romantic gesture, but as a profound experiment in what it means to love in a world of impermanence. And that is the real story. It is not about wealth, not about diamonds, not even about tradition. It is about the human brain's ability to create permanence through meaning, to turn atoms into symbols, to transform a simple object into an eternal anchor. And as we continue this exploration, I want you to hold on to one question. What does it mean when we give someone an object that carries a piece of our soul? Because that is the essence of this story, and it is far greater than any piece of jewelry could ever be. When we give someone an object that carries a piece of our soul, we are engaging in one of the most ancient and mysterious forms of human communication. Long before language evolved, long before symbols were written in stone, humans exchanged tokens. A carved bone, a bead, a stone shaped by hand. These were not just decorations, they were encoded messages of trust, belonging, and connection. The engagement ring we speak of is simply the latest chapter in this ancient story. Yet what makes it fascinating is that it was not constructed out of habit, but out of conscious design, as if to say, I understand the neuroscience of love, the psychology of memory, and the fragility of time, and I choose to put all of that knowledge into this single object. Consider what happens neurologically when you give such a gift. The act of receiving it activates the brain's reward circuitry. The nucleus accumbens lights up, dopamine floods in, and suddenly this object is forever tagged as special. But what makes it endure is not that first surge of reward. It is the repetition of meaning. Every time the wearer looks at it, touches it, remembers the story behind it, those neural pathways strengthen. It becomes not just a ring, but a neural extension of the relationship itself. And this is why the story matters so much, because without story, without sacrifice, the object is inert. With story, it becomes alive. This ring, for example, carried within it an intentional link to the future. It was not designed as a static piece, but as a dynamic reminder of what is yet to come. Hidden inside the band was an engraving, not visible unless you tilted it at a certain angle, in a certain light. And that engraving was not a date from the past, but a projection of the future. A dream, a destination, a vision of a shared life not yet lived. Neuroscientifically, this is brilliant. Why? Because the brain is driven not only by memory, but by anticipation. We do not live in the past, we live in the tension between memory and future prediction. By embedding the future into the ring itself, the designer created a perpetual engine of hope. Each time it is seen, it is not merely recalling what has been promised, but reinforcing the possibility of what is to come. Think about how unusual that is. Most engagement rings point backward, to tradition, to lineage, to cultural expectations. This one pointed forward. It was less about saying, "We have arrived," and more about whispering, "We are becoming." And that is powerful, because love is not a static state, it is a process, a continual act of becoming together. I remember once speaking with an elderly couple who had been married for over 60 years. They told me the secret was not in grand gestures, not in perfect harmony, but in constantly choosing each other, day after day, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was hard. That constant choosing rewires the brain. Oxytocin strengthens trust circuits. The hippocampus stores moments of resilience. The amygdala, which usually fires in fear, begins to soften in the presence of the beloved. The ring I am speaking of was designed with that in mind, not as a frozen monument, but as a living symbol, one that evolves as the relationship evolves. And this takes us into the deeper truth. The real story behind this engagement ring is not about the material, but about the way humans weave their stories into objects. This ring became a laboratory of meaning, each element tested, considered, selected not for aesthetics alone, but for what it would whisper to the subconscious mind. Imagine the courage it takes to do that. To reject the easy road of tradition, and instead craft something that speaks directly to the architecture of the brain and heart. Of course, skeptics will always ask, does it matter? Isn't it just a ring? And here is where I would challenge that skepticism. Because if you dismiss it as just a ring, then you must also dismiss a flag as just fabric, or a wedding vow as just words, or a photograph as just ink on paper. The truth is, humans are meaning-making creatures. Without meaning, nothing matters. With meaning, everything changes. The ring is a portal, not to wealth, not to status, but to shared consciousness. There is another layer to this story that few know. The creation of this ring required a sacrifice. Not financial. That would be too easy. The sacrifice was time. Time that could have been spent on work, on projects, on ambitions. But instead, it was spent in careful design, sourcing, choosing, refining. That is the deeper gift. When someone gives you time, when they take the most finite resource of their existence and embed it into something for you. That is the truest form of love. Neuroscientifically, this aligns with what we know about attention. Attention is the purest form of presence. When we give someone our undivided attention, we are saying, out of everything in the universe, I choose you. This ring carried that attention. Every curve, every angle, every element spoke of that sacrifice of time and focus. And yet, there was humility in it too. The ring was not designed to scream. It was designed to whisper. To the unknowing eye, perhaps it seemed simple, understated. But to the one who knew the story, it was infinite. That paradox, the ordinary appearance hiding extraordinary meaning, is what makes it so compelling. Because isn't that the nature of love itself? To outsiders, a couple may look ordinary, but within their shared world they carry galaxies. Now, I want to address something very human, the skepticism people often feel towards symbols. We live in a culture that prizes logic, efficiency, practicality. Why pour so much thought into a ring when love is what really matters? But here is where science surprises us. Love without symbols fades. Our brains need anchors. Just as neurons need synapses to connect, relationships need tangible points of contact to stabilize. The ring is not the love, but without it, love risks drifting unmoored. This is why across millennia, every culture has created tokens of commitment. They are not luxuries. They are neurological necessities. And this particular ring, its real story, teaches us something profound about how to live. That permanence is an illusion, but meaning is real. That wealth is fleeting, but attention is priceless. That perfection is a myth, but imperfection, embraced together, is strength. I once read about an experiment where participants were given 2 mugs, one mass-produced, flawless, shiny. The other was handmade, slightly uneven, carrying a tiny chip on its rim. When asked which they would keep, most chose the imperfect one. Why? Because it felt alive, human, real. This engagement ring followed the same principle. It was not flawless. It was human, and that is why it carried so much weight. So, when you ask what is the real story behind this engagement ring, the answer is not in its design alone, not in its stone, not in its price. The real story is that it was constructed as a living experiment in what it means to love. It was proof that love is not found in excess, but in intentionality. That our brains, our hearts, our very identities need symbols to hold on to, and that the most powerful symbols are those crafted with vulnerability, sacrifice, and vision. As I reflect on this, I can't help but think of how objects outlive us. Long after the giver and receiver are gone, the ring will remain, and someone else will hold it and wonder at the story it carries. Maybe they won't know the full truth. Maybe they'll never uncover the deliberate imperfections, the engraved future, the sacrifice hidden in its making. But the essence will still be there, because meaning, once poured into an object, never fully disappears. It echoes, like a memory stored not in neurons, but in matter itself. That is why this story is important, not because of one ring, but because of what it teaches all of us. That in a world obsessed with surfaces, we must dare to create depth. That in a culture that worships perfection, we must dare to embrace flaws. That in a time when love is often measured in numbers, we must remember that the greatest value comes from intention. And if there is one thing I want you to take away tonight, it is this: that when we give someone a piece of ourselves, whether through a ring, or a gesture, or a promise, we are not just giving them an object. We are giving them a map of who we are, and who we hope to become with them. And that is where love becomes eternal. Eternity is not something we can hold in our hands. And yet, paradoxically, we try. We etch it into stone, we melt it into metal, we press it into words that we hope will outlast us. The engagement ring I have been telling you about is one of those paradoxes. A small, finite object that dares to carry an infinite meaning. But perhaps that is the point. We humans are finite creatures with infinite desires, and so we invent symbols to bridge that gap. When we study the brain, we see this paradox everywhere. Neurons fire in electrical bursts lasting milliseconds, yet those fleeting sparks create memories that endure for decades. Proteins break down and rebuild in cycles, yet somehow your identity remains continuous across a lifetime. The ring was designed with this same paradox in mind. Its materials may tarnish, its edges may wear, but the story it carries, if lived fully, will outlast both giver and receiver. That is the miracle of human meaning, making we take the temporary and we make it eternal. But there is another layer to the story, one that speaks less about love as romance and more about love as responsibility. The person who gave this ring understood something that most overlook, that love is not just about two individuals. Love ripples outward. It affects families, communities, and even the future of our species. This ring was crafted with that ripple effect in mind. Its materials were ethically sourced, its design avoided needless waste, its symbolism extended beyond me and you, into us and the world. That decision was not trivial. It was a declaration that true love is not isolation, but contribution. Neuroscience backs this up. Studies show that when we act not just for ourselves, but for the greater good, our brains release oxytocin at even higher levels. Generosity strengthens bonding, not just with the partner, but with humanity as a whole. By embedding responsibility into this symbol, the ring became not just a token of personal commitment, but a commitment to the planet, to the generations that will inherit it. That, to me, is astonishing, because it shows us that love can be engineered not only to last within two people, but to expand far beyond them. And yet, for all its design, for all its science, for all its intentionality, the true power of this ring comes down to something simpler, something raw: vulnerability. To give an engagement ring is to make yourself vulnerable. You are saying, "Here is a piece of myself, and I trust you not to break it." That act, psychologically, is one of the riskiest and most courageous things a human can do. And yet, it is also the very thing that makes life worth living. Without that leap of faith, there is no connection, no intimacy, no shared future. The ring, then, is not just a symbol of what is promised, but of the risk we are willing to take for love. Think about the courage it takes to believe in permanence in a world that offers none. To say, forever, even when you know that forever is not guaranteed. To carve eternity into metal and stone, even when entropy will one day reclaim it all. That courage is what makes the story of this ring so powerful, because it is not blind optimism. It is conscious defiance. It is looking into the uncertainty of the future and saying, "I choose you anyway." And perhaps that is the deepest truth of all, that love is not about certainty. It is about choosing in the face of uncertainty. The ring, with its deliberate imperfections, with its hidden engraving, with its understated design, embodied that truth. It whispered, "This is not perfect. This is not eternal, but it is real. And because it is real, it is worth everything." Let me share with you one final reflection. Years from now, when this ring is no longer on the hand of its wearer, when it rests in a drawer or a museum, or perhaps even lost in the soil of the earth, someone will find it. They may not know its story. They may hold it in their hand and wonder. And yet, even without the words, even without the backstory, they will sense something. Because objects, when filled with meaning, radiate that meaning beyond the bounds of memory. They carry with them an aura of intention. That is the true legacy of this ring, that it was never just about one couple, one promise, one moment. It was about showing us all what it means to live with depth, to love with vulnerability, to create with responsibility. So, when you next see an engagement ring, whether simple or elaborate, flawless or imperfect, I invite you to look beyond its surface. Ask yourself, what story does it carry? Whose time, whose sacrifice, whose vulnerability is etched into its metal? Because that, and only that, is where the real value lies. And if you take nothing else from this story, take this: that love is not measured in carats, but in courage, not in perfection, but in presence, not in price, but in purpose. The real story behind this engagement ring is the story of all of us. Our need to anchor meaning in a fleeting world, our hunger to carve permanence into impermanence, our endless quest to turn fragile human lives into something timeless. That is why this story matters, not because of who gave the ring or who received it, but because it reminds us of what we are capable of when we love with intention. It reminds us that even in a universe of entropy and decay, we can create symbols that defy it. We can choose to pour our souls into objects, into gestures, into each other, and in doing so, we touch eternity. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us not be fooled by surfaces. Let us dare to look deeper, to create meaning where others see only matter, to love not as consumption, but as creation. For in the end, that is what makes us human. That is what gives us hope. And that is the real story, not just behind one ring, but behind every act of love that dares to say, even in the face of impermanence, I choose forever.